Berlin. April 1945. The city was in ruins. Soviet artillery thundered overhead. Fires raged across the skyline. Beneath the crumbling Reich chancellery, Adolf Hitler withdrew into the shadows for the last time. 30 feet below ground, in a reinforced concrete chamber known as the Führerbunker, the dictator of Nazi Germany spent his final days. The walls were damp, the air stale. Telephone wires snaked through the tunnels. Guards stood silently at steel doors. Hitler's world had collapsed, but he had refused to leave this underground command post. On 30th of April, with Soviet forces just blocks away, he took his own life alongside Eva Braun. Their bodies were carried outside and burned in the garden above, just yards from the entrance. By 2nd May, the Red Army had captured the site. What they found shocked even them. Maps still lay across desks. Dishes rested in the sink. Half-burnt documents filled the air with the scent of scorched paper. The bunker system, still intact, stretched beneath the government quarter, and deeper beneath the war's end. New questions began to surface. What else had the Nazis built underground? What happened to these bunkers after the war? Were they destroyed, buried, or reused in the silence after the surrender? A different kind of battle began, not for land, but for the memory, the myth, and the concrete legacy of Hitler's final refuge. One fact is certain: the war ended above ground. But part of the Third Reich remained sealed in the soil below. Long before the final days in Berlin, Hitler had been building downward. In the mid-1930s, as Nazi power consolidated, construction began on a network of bunkers designed not just for military use, but for psychological control. Hitler, increasingly obsessed with assassination and aerial bombing, demanded hardened underground spaces across his empire. The most infamous was the Führerbunker in Berlin, a 2-level reinforced shelter constructed beneath the Reich chancellery. By 1944, it had been expanded to include private quarters, a conference room, and secure communications lines. It was the final node in a growing system of subterranean command centers. In the Bavarian Alps, at Obersalzberg, Hitler's mountain retreat, known as the Berghof, sat above a sprawling bunker complex. Deep inside the mountain, vaults and tunnels were built to withstand bombing raids and serve as secure command posts. Further east, in the forests of modern-day Poland, the Wolfschanze Wolf's Lair became Hitler's military headquarters during the Eastern Front campaign. With over 50 bunkers and buildings, the site was heavily camouflaged and surrounded by minefields. It was here, in July 1944, that Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler with a briefcase bomb. The explosion failed, but the paranoia grew. These bunkers were not merely protective shells. They symbolized the Nazi regime's desire for permanent structures of concrete meant to outlast bombardment and perhaps even time. Some were built with ventilation systems, generators, and multi-layered blast doors. Others featured escape tunnels and hidden chambers. Yet these constructions also mirrored Hitler's psychological retreat from the real world. As the war turned against Germany, he spent more time in isolation, surrounded by thick walls, filtered air, and loyalists who dared not speak hard truths. The bunkers were fortresses, but they were also prisons. By the spring of 1945, Hitler's empire was disintegrating, and so were its bunkers. On 20 April, Hitler descended into the Führerbunker for the final time. Outside, the Red Army tightened its grip on Berlin. Inside, the dictator met with generals, signed doomed orders, and watched his world collapse through radio reports. 10 days later, on 30th of April, he killed himself alongside Eva Braun. Loyal aides carried their bodies outside, soaked them in petrol, and set them alight. The garden above the Reich Chancellery turned to ash. When Soviet troops entered the city on the 2nd May, they found the bunker complex mostly intact. Steel doors had been blown open. Cables and debris littered the floors. Some rooms still held personal effects uniforms, half-empty bottles, a dog leash from Hitler's beloved Blondie. But the Soviets said little. They cordoned off the area and seized control. Joseph Stalin initially withheld confirmation of Hitler's death, fueling rumors of escape. Meanwhile, the Führerbunker was classified, mapped, and studied in secret. Beyond Berlin, other bunkers met different fates. The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia was demolished by retreating German engineers in January 1945. Massive explosions cratered the landscape, but large sections remained impossible to fully destroy. In Bavaria, the Berghof and surrounding Obersalzberg complex were bombed by Allied aircraft in late April. American troops later arrived to find ruins looted by civilians and soldiers alike. Some underground chambers survived, partially hidden beneath collapsed structures. Across these sites, destruction was partial, inconsistent, and deeply symbolic. The Third Reich had fallen, but its architecture remained, at least for now. What the Allies would do next with these remnants depended on politics, intelligence, and the emerging lines of the Cold War. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied forces moved swiftly to secure, conceal, or destroy what remained of Hitler's bunkers. In Berlin, the Führerbunker was captured and closed off by Soviet troops. They removed evidence, conducted secret examinations, and sealed the site behind barbed wire and silence. The Soviets refused to confirm Hitler's death publicly, a strategy that created confusion and fueled escape theories for years. At Obersalzberg, American soldiers took control of the ruins in May 1945. They salvaged documents, artwork, and personal effects. The Eagle's Nest, Hitler's mountaintop tea house, was left largely untouched, while the Berghof lay in rubble. Allied commanders debated whether to preserve or erase the site. Some bunkers were simply too large to demolish. The underground networks in Bavaria, designed to withstand Allied bombs, became temporary command posts and storage sites. U.S. forces mapped and photographed the tunnels, but allowed local authorities to fill in or repurpose many of them in the years ahead. In East Prussia, the ruins of the Wolf's Lair remained dangerous, still laced with mines and partially intact. Soviet troops cleared only a portion. Civilians were forbidden to enter. The site became a curiosity off limits, but not forgotten. French occupation forces, meanwhile, conducted their own investigations at captured sites, contributing to growing Allied intelligence files on Nazi engineering, weapons programs, and underground logistics. Despite the military attention, the general public remained largely unaware of these bunkers. Maps were redrawn, access was restricted. The remnants of Hitler's underground empire slipped into silence, hidden, scarred, and politically sensitive. But this silence would not last. As Cold War tensions escalated, these ruins would take on new strategic and symbolic roles. As the Cold War dawned, Hitler's bunkers slipped into a strange twilight, part propaganda, part secrecy, and part reinvention. The Soviet Union, having seized the Führerbunker and surrounding areas in Berlin, tightly controlled access. Stalin's regime refused to release photographs or details about Hitler's death. Instead, they cultivated mystery. Soviet newspapers suggested Hitler had escaped. These rumors, carefully managed, served as psychological weapons during the early Cold War. undermining Western narratives of Nazi defeat. The site of the Führerbunker was gradually buried, built over with East German apartment blocks and a car park. No monument marked its place, no plaque. Officially, it ceased to exist. Yet, behind closed doors, remnants of Nazi bunkers were not ignored, they were studied. East German authorities repurposed some surviving underground structures for military storage and civil defense. Deep in Berlin and other cities, hardened shelters built by the Third Reich were adapted to serve new ideological masters. In the West, American and British intelligence reviewed captured plans of Obersalzberg and the Wolf's Lair. U.S. military engineers studied German concrete technology, noting its durability. Some theories even suggested the bunker designs influenced early NATO bunker systems. At the same time, Hitler's possible survival became a theme in pulp novels, tabloids, and films. In 1950, when Stalin admitted Hitler had likely died in Berlin, it was too late. The myths had already taken root. The bunkers, now sealed and mostly invisible, became fertile ground for speculation. Conspiracy theories flourished for intelligence services. This ambiguity wasn't always a problem. It kept enemies guessing and the public distracted. But myths have a shelf life. Eventually, physical reality would resurface. By the late 20th century, Hitler's bunkers faced diverging fates, some demolished, some hidden, others reluctantly opened to the public. In Berlin, the Soviet and later East German governments undertook systematic efforts to erase traces of the Führerbunker. In 1947, much of the complex was blown up with explosives. Later, during construction of the Plattenbau housing blocks in the 1980s, additional sections were buried or filled in. No signs marked the location. The goal was deliberate historical amnesia, but attempts to erase were not always effective. Locals whispered about what lay beneath the car parks. Tourists arrived with old maps. In 2006, after growing public pressure, a discreet sign was installed near the site, acknowledging its existence without glamorizing it. Meanwhile, in Poland, the Wolf's Lair followed a different path. Initially cordoned off by Soviet forces, it was later opened to the public. Over time, it became a grim tourist destination, drawing visitors to the shattered bunkers and the site of the failed 1944 assassination attempt. Restoration efforts have been cautious, preserve the history without glorifying it. In Bavaria, Obersalzberg presented another dilemma. The Berghof ruins were largely demolished by 1952, but the Eagle's Nest remained. Perched on a mountaintop, it became a restaurant and viewpoint. While the building had little direct connection to Hitler, it drew tourists by the thousands. Locals and historians debated preserve as warning or remove as symbol. Germany's official policy emphasized non-memorialization, avoiding any shrine-like preservation of Nazi sites. Still, underground bunkers were sometimes rediscovered by accident during construction projects, through urban exploration or via archival research. These ruins, once designed for secrecy and survival, now stood at the crossroads of memory, discomfort, and reluctant curiosity. From the 1950s to the early 2000s, the presence of Hitler's bunkers continued to provoke controversy both in Germany and beyond. In West Germany, a strong post-war ethos emerged never again. This meant not only prosecuting Nazi crimes, but also reshaping public space to prevent the rise of extremist symbolism. As a result, most remnants of Nazi architecture, especially the bunkers, were either demolished, sealed, or left unmarked. Memory was managed through absence. Yet this approach sparked debates. Some argued that erasure bred ignorance. Others feared that any visible trace might attract neo-Nazi pilgrimage. The balance between remembrance and rejection became a national tension. At Obersalzberg, the tension played out in concrete. In the late 1990s, the Bavarian government opened the Documentation Obersalzberg, a historical center designed to educate visitors about the Nazi past. Built near the original bunkers, the center walked a tightrope inform without glorify, preserve without promote. Still, some critics believed that even acknowledging these sites gave them undeserved prominence. In Berlin, urban renewal repeatedly uncovered sealed chambers. Each time, public interest surged. Journalists, historians, and conspiracy theorists flooded the discussion. Should the city expose the site or rebury it in Eastern Europe, where bunkers like the Wolf's Lair stood on Polish soil, governments struggled with similar questions. Was it a historical site or a grotesque relic? Tourist brochures emphasized the failed assassination attempt, avoiding Hitler's name where possible. The broader question lingered: can architecture ever be separated from the ideology it served? The bunkers were mute, but their presence spoke volumes. Germany chose silence, others chose education, but no nation found the answer easy. In 1981, on a quiet evening broadcast in West Germany, an interview aired that would briefly reopen old wounds. The guest was Erich Kempka, once Hitler's personal chauffeur and a direct witness to the last days in the Führerbunker. With trembling voice, he described the moment he helped carry Hitler's body to the garden above, doused it in fuel, and lit the match. It was not heroism. He said it was duty and fear. Other testimonies followed in later years. Rochus Misch, Hitler's former radio operator and bodyguard, granted interviews in the 2000s. He spoke not with pride, but with matter-of-fact recall of the narrow corridors, the endless hours in airless rooms, the silence that followed the gunshot on 30th of April 1945. These men had lived in the bunkers, slept in steel-framed beds, taken orders from behind thick walls, and witnessed the collapse from within. For decades, most had remained silent, wary of public scorn or prosecution. Their accounts, however personal, added dimension to a place often clouded in myth. They described not monsters, but men disintegrating under pressure, panic, betrayal, disillusionment. The final atmosphere underground was more tragic than triumphant. One guard recounted how, after the suicide, he sat in the dim corridor outside Hitler's room, cigarette trembling in his hand, unable to process what had just occurred. He was 19. None of these stories glorified. They illuminated. Today, those voices are nearly gone, but their memories remain scattered through interviews, memoirs, and archived recordings. Within the concrete walls, beneath meters of soil, the end of the Reich had a human face, and that face, worn and terrified, still haunts the silence. Today, the fate of Hitler's bunkers is a study in contradictions, absence marked by presence, erasure shadowed by memory, of the dozens of bunkers built under the Third Reich. Most no longer function as visible sites. The Führerbunker in Berlin lies buried beneath a parking lot, surrounded by apartment buildings. Only a small informational sign installed in 2006 after decades of debate indicates what once lay beneath. At Obersalzberg, the Berghof has vanished, but underground passages remain sealed behind steel gates. Nearby, the Documentation Obersalzberg now welcomes visitors seeking context, not spectacle. The Eagle's Nest still stands, though largely detached from its wartime associations. In Poland, the Wolf's Lair is open to the public, its colossal wreckage a stark contrast to the silence imposed in Germany. Tour guides recount the assassination attempt, not the man it failed to kill, and still, questions persist. What exactly remains underground in Berlin? Why were some bunkers spared, others obliterated? Can any place tied to atrocity be neutral ground? One fact is certain: the bunkers were never just concrete. They were instruments of power, symbols of paranoia, and, ultimately, chambers of collapse. Their walls heard orders that reshaped continents. They also heard the end. The truth remains: while most were buried, the memory of Hitler's bunkers cannot be so easily sealed. They force nations to confront not just where history happened, but how it should be remembered or not remembered at all. And so, beneath the soil, behind apartment walls and forest trails, the bunkers persist not as shrines, but as uneasy footnotes to a war that never truly let go.